We are not saying we're not going to have highways or airports or high-speed rail, right? We are saying that these cities, in order to thrive and survive, need these de-infrastructured networks that create this localism and connections that are critical for resilience, and tie into those larger infrastructures, right? If that makes sense. So to me, it's complementary, and not, it's not replacing.
This is the Regenerative Real Estate Podcast. Revitalizing the world together. Welcome to the Regenerative Real Estate Podcast. This is your host, Neil Collins. It is a show that is supported by our work at Latitude Realty. In it, we explore our natural and built environments and how they can be used as a force for good. The show sets out to inspire impactful ideas, meaningful change, human wellness, and ecological restoration through interviews and easy-to-digest conversations. Our guests range from industry leaders to iconoclasts, from both well-known figures to everyday people leading extraordinary lives. This is a show for people looking for education and inspiration on how real estate can be done differently. Hey everybody, welcome back to another episode of the Regenerative Real Estate Podcast. I'm really excited today because straight out of Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, we have Stephen Baumgartner, who's the director and founder of the Baumgartner Urban Systems Strategy. That is a bit of a mouthful there, Stephen. I would love to really dive into your work. And I want to tell listeners, just first and foremost, why you're on here is because I read an article that you had written about a term that I'd never heard before, but was instantly captivated, called deinfrastructuring. Or that was the essence of the concept. And I realized you're talking about urban planning and decentralization of infrastructure, and a lot of these concepts that don't routinely get talked about very often outside of the planning world or the development world. But it was like, this is what the essence of how we're living our lives and the impacts that we're all experiencing, from the grid shutting down in Texas to just how we live our normal everyday lives. And so I'm really excited to have you on and really just dive into the meat of your work here. But just to introduce yourself, I knew you grew up outside of Utica, New York, but tell me a little bit about your background here.
Yeah, well, thank you, Neil, and thanks so much for having me. And if I may, happy birthday to you. Baumgartner Urban Systems Strategy is a mouthful. And just really quickly on that name, I have a 9-year-old daughter, and for reasons unknown, I actually called her Boos since she was born. And then when I was standing at my firm and thinking about names, and I had always used the term urban system strategy, which I'll talk to you a little bit more about as we get through this. But the name BUSS just kind of jumped off the page, and Boos was born. And for Father's Day, it was super sweet. My daughter actually made us shirts. Hers said the original Boos, and mine just said Boos, which is really an amazing Father's Day gift. But yeah, I'm in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. My family and I have been out here for about 5 years, and yeah, we absolutely love the city. I had spent most of my professional life in New York City, where I met my wife and really I think established a lot of the sort of foundational lessons that have led me to where I am now, and we can certainly talk more about those and my sort of professional arc. But yeah, I guess the story starts outside of Utica, New York, born and raised in a small town, which, without any irony, I truly believe was the best place on earth. Like I absolutely loved it. I loved the networks we had there, the family. My grandparents were there. Grew up with a couple older brothers and great parents that taught me a bunch of valuable lessons. And I'm back there often still, actually going up there for the 4th of July weekend.
Well, that's a big move to go from outside of. And what was the town? Were you in Utica?
It was, yeah, a small sort of suburb of Utica called New Hartford is where I grew up.
So
Yeah.
to go from New Hartford to New York City, that's a big scenery change. In one, I mean, one of the world's most notorious megapolises and metropolises of New York City. What an interesting move. What was that more of the catalyst that got you into planning and engineering?
Yeah, I think I was always intrigued with cities. It wasn't a direct move. I spent 4 years at Union College outside of Schenectady, New York, studying mechanical engineering. I loved Union. It was a sort of perfect balance of sort of technical rigor, but also sort of liberal arts feel. Great sort of balance of sort of technical and also sort of artsy humanities folks, and almost all my friends are in that sort of realm from college days. And then actually spent a lot of time in Boston and in DC before most of my time in New York. And I think I was always intrigued by the certainly the buzz of urban centers, and the opportunities, and just the idea of simple, connected, walkable living. And even in our communities that we built in New York, those types of sort of local, really strong connections were what we were looking for in Pittsburgh and found. So certainly there's a huge variety of feels and looks and densities in the cities I just mentioned, but I think what I had in common with all of them was a really strong sense of sort of feeling like I'm part of a local community, even in a dense urban center.
That's interesting that you're seeking out. Would you say that you're seeking out more of the community, or more of a professional aspiration to go to these iconic power centers of the United States?
Yeah, I think not unlike most folks, all of the above. Certainly, the arcs, the sort of 3 or 4 year reinventions of my professional career over the decades have been driven by multiple aspects of my life, some more professional, some more personal. But I don't think I've prioritized one of those aspects over the other. I think I've pretty successfully found the balance. It's impossible to not jump into New York and just feel the vibrancy, the buzz, the opportunity. I mean, it's overwhelming. It can be overwhelming in some ways. But I look back on my decade plus in New York with such joy and sort of just feeling extraordinarily fortunate for the people I was able to work with and around, for the opportunities it provided me to understand the sort of global world of design, engineering, architecture, urbanism. It's obviously just a center for design thought in the world. And through my career, I was really fortunate to be able to rub against some of those great thought leaders.
What did that work look like whenever you were in DC, Boston, and New York? Was it more on the engineering side? Were you doing planning work then?
Yeah, thanks. So it's been interesting arc. Again, I started out very detailed engineering at a building scale. Most of my time in Boston was with an engineering firm that was doing building engineering. So I learned a lot about how buildings worked, how chillers get spec'd, how distribution systems get sized, and how to resolve conflicts around engineering systems. I think that was an extraordinarily important part of my professional development, to get into detail and really learn the nuances of mechanical, electrical, plumbing, electrical design at a building scale. When I actually moved to DC, I sort of jumped into more of an architecture engineering type of practice, where that really led me to kind of have an appreciation for integrated design, collaboration. And I was really drawn to that. Although I felt like I really loved the engineering and the detail, I was always sort of trying to probe a little bit more about what real problems we were trying to solve, like how to really create better processes and address some of our bigger challenges, frankly. And I found that in an architecture, an AE firm, where I could rub elbows with more designers and architecture architectural designers and leaders. And frankly, moving actually back to New York, and all of these jumps are not coincidental. It actually led me to really challenge scale. I joined Borough Happold in New York City, and I was placed in a sustainability team where I was really given some sort of brand permission, and through that sort of my sustainability title, to get beyond the building scale and really start to look at how our systems are working in and around our cities and communities. And from that point, and again, in New York and through a great set of design collaborators, I was really opened up to a world of potential to be a kind of consultant and a kind of orchestrator of all of those systems coming together at a beyond building scale. So my arc has really jumped a little bit in scales and in a balance of sort of technical work and strategic work. And all of those lessons, I think, really set me up to where I want to be, to what I love to do professionally, and to the sort of foundations of how I've set up Boost.
Stephen, you said a beautiful nugget there that I'd love to dig into more. You said you had the opportunity to challenge scale. What is the conventional thinking around that? I mean, what were you challenging there that we could really learn a little bit more?
Yeah, and this is a really interesting part of the sort of architecture, engineering, construction industry, that most of the folks who are designing or engineering a problem set are given a boundary. Make this room cleaner, healthier, more vibrant. Make this building greener, healthier, low embodied energy. Make this campus greener, better green infrastructure, more efficient space utilization, et cetera. We are prioritized financially to live and stay within those boundaries because that's what the design brief says, that's what we're paid to do. The magic really happens between those scales, right? So when you are given a building to build or to reposition or to really look at and how it can sort of perform better, this is not novel what I'm about to say, but it absolutely needs to be looked at within the context of its surroundings, right? How does the building support the community, the campus, the district, et cetera? And if you can't find space in the process to ask those questions because you're disincentivized to do it, you're not paid to do it, then you're potentially solving the wrong problem. So with a title like a sustainability, planner or environmental engineer or something that actually can sit between boundaries, you're actually given some sort of permission to ask those questions. Well, maybe we don't need another mechanical engineering plant room in this building because there's something happening right next door that we can leverage, right? Maybe this building doesn't need a green roof because we want to capture the water and use it next door or in something else outside the boundary, right? So challenging scale is creating space in the process to ask the tough questions about how the system is working and how the interventions we're making can positively impact that system.
Where my mind goes is that if you get to play outside those conventional boundaries, it's amazing because there's a whole new realm of systems thinking to understand how there's nested systems within nested systems. But we've fractionalized our urban environments by ownerships of this is our plot and this is my building, that's your building, these are the city streets. Very hard to talk with each other, especially once you interface with public utility companies and in the municipalities. Were you able to actually play in that space?
Yeah, exactly. And it's some are more challenging than others, right? I mean, when you start to work in campuses and on and around campuses, you actually find an amazing opportunity to challenge scale, because when these universities are investing in buildings, they're also thinking about the way the buildings sit within the campus boundary. They're going to hold this land for hundreds of years, et cetera. So they can start making longer term investments that have life cycle paybacks, right? When you start to get into urban centers, multiple ownership structures, those types of investment priorities break down. So when you're challenging scale, it's not just the technical solutions you're trying to evaluate, it's how these things can be financed, how they can be maintained, right? And what types of innovative, potentially partnerships or structures can start to enable these investments that can sit across scales.
Wow.
And it's really challenging, and we as an industry struggle, frankly, to find a lot of these types of public and private investments that really create systems approaches across ownership boundaries. And this is what the article gets to, right, Neil, is the idea that if we don't start putting time and space into our processes to challenge those scales, I think we're solving the wrong problems and living in these isolated boxes without really addressing our biggest challenges. So every problem set's unique, but really what I'm doing is asking those tough questions and trying to find space in those processes to really be intentional about solving the systems problem, not an isolated problem, if that makes sense.
I'd love to be a fly on the wall in some of those conversations, as it reminds me of a question that I got several years ago, just what watershed do I live in?
Right.
And I didn't immediately know, and ashamed to say, but it's really revolutionized how I go about thinking of this. If you're coming from the watershed level, you're not thinking about necessarily boundaries of the municipality that you're working in. And I think that's really where questions can unlock a ton of potential.
That is a great example, because we can all appreciate that, right? If we have like our home as a boundary and we're downstream from our neighbor, water comes off their property into ours, you see it, right? But you just touched on something. So rarely do we just ask the questions, where does our stuff come from and where does it go, right? Our stuff being our food, right? Our energy, our water, the stuff that we can see is easy. We know that we can get in a car and drive somewhere. We can get on a bus. We can ride a bike. We can go to a farm potentially and get a piece of fruit or whatever. The stuff we can't see becomes very abstract. And again, this is in the article. How do we provide systems that we can interact with and then influence? But I think it first starts with, again, just taking time to do a little bit of research before you start investing in your city, your campus, your building. How do we sit within all of these nested systems? And this doesn't have to be a 6-month evaluation, right? You get the right design team members around and they can find this information pretty quickly. Like, this is the watershed you're in. This is where your energy comes from. Here's this is your energy grid mix, and this is where power gets to your building and its general vulnerabilities. This is where water comes from. This is where it goes after you flush the toilet. This is where your waste goes, right? These are not difficult questions to answer with the right groups around you, but they so rarely get positioned, or what I usually call placed on the wall. You don't use them to drive everything, but they're always on the wall while you're making decisions. So you make sure you're not negatively impacting something at the benefit of another element of the project, right? So you have to get that stuff on the wall before you start making decisions.
So many great thoughts come up, even contradictory thoughts, because the premise of the show and a lot of our work is based upon mindfulness and awareness around, where does the water go whenever it hits our roof? Where is our energy coming from? Where are our nutrients coming from? And then where do they go once they hit the basin of our sink or go into our toilet or, go out the door in a bin? And I've heard people say, I just want to eat the meal. I don't need to know how it was cooked. But I think that line of maybe apathy is not the right word, but it's the only one coming to me this early in the morning I've seen, if it's out of mind, out of sight, it's out of mind, and we're living in a culture of convenience. And so whenever I read this article that you had put out around, hey, the energy systems and the food and the water and how that all really ties together and how that expands upon the 15-minute city concept, which I do want you to explain to the listeners. But for me, I realized that, a lot of the progressive urbanism concepts like a 15-minute city or a 15-minute neighborhood really is based on transportation. And it doesn't necessarily hit on food and water and other things like that. Maybe that's a good jumping off point of, what is a 15-minute city that you're talking about? And then let's evolve into, these different aspects of it.
Yeah, that's great. And I just want to quickly touch on something that you mentioned. The idea of, out of sight, out of mind is dissolving, right? We are now, more of us are getting confronted directly and indirectly with the impacts of fragile systems, right? We don't know how fragile these things are until they break, right? And it's happening at a macro, global scale with supply chain. It's happening locally all over the world with breakdowns of localized sort of community infrastructure. And then we're like, why did my power go out? Oh, it wasn't just a tree at my neighbor's. It was actually something down the road and to the left. And we're asking questions about that system now, right? And the more of those sort of breakdowns that happen with really fragile systems, the more I think we're going to want to understand how we can live within them and affect them positively to maintain the lifestyles that we've been afforded, as well as address all of the massive inequities that our fragile infrastructure has provided. So I really want to touch on that as we get into this because it's a critical part of this deinfrastructuring principle. But the 15-minute city, to answer your question, is a concept that's I think kind of percolated up from a few sources, but really brought to center of attention through the work in Paris. The mayor has really anchored a kind of sustainable development principle around the idea that cities should sort of be organized through land use planning and smart mobility systems to enable everybody 15-minute access to all of their amenities and lifestyles and health services and food, et cetera. So in a 15-minute I'll sort of add a little caveat, a non-carbon, mode, like a walk or a bike, or maybe you could throw an e-bike in there. You should be able to access all of those sort of human services and amenities. And this is amazing. I actually was privileged to be on a Zoom listening to Carlos Moreno, who's actually been the sort of 15-minute city czar in Paris. And when you hear the words 15-minute city, you think of it as more like a formula, right? You should layer this 15-minute concept on your city and do the math and draw the radii and solve for it. And it really isn't a formula. It's not a sort of prescription for success. It's really a philosophy and a kind of framework to ask the questions about how we can create more equitable, connected, polycentric communities in our urban environments. And when I read the numerous articles and sort of thought pieces on the 15-minute city, it's very mobility focused by definition. It's about connecting people to amenities and services. And I just think that there's such an amazing opportunity within that construct to address some of the things we're talking about. It shouldn't just be about connecting people to those amenities. It should be about how these enabling systems can perform within those types of districts and neighborhoods and communities. And I use the term deinfrastructuring, which is really about breaking down these larger, often opaque systems that we don't understand, breaking them down to this sort of localized level, to the community scale, so that we can see them, understand them, live with them, influence them, connect the supply with the demand more efficiently and sustainably, and create more of these resilient and equitable networks. So as, and the article gets into this, as we have sort of de-infrastructured the mobility system, right, around this 15-minute construct, we should also be doing the same thing with our energy, water, food, technology systems. So using the 15-minute city construct to really de-infrastructure, I think, is a fundamental way forward for our cities and communities to address our biggest challenges.
Wow. Let's actually emphasize this term de-infrastructuring. Why that term? I mean, in one way, it's almost bolstering the infrastructure to make it much more localized and resilient.
Yeah, well, let's be clear. I made it up. It's not. It's a term that I actually have been using for some time. We talk about decentralizing. The idea of instead of one large energy infrastructure that has coal or nuclear plants in some place that we've never been to or heard of, and these big high voltage transmission and distribution systems that then find local, substations and low voltage or medium voltage distribution, this sort of heavy infrastructure, right? Energy as a sort of metaphor. You can have a similar type of conversation about our water systems and even our mobility systems. But the idea of sort of decentralizing, breaking down that heavy thing into multiple different centralized nodes. And the idea of de-infrastructuring is not eliminating the heavy. It's finding localized ways to decentralize and sort of break down and dissolve, right, a little more of that. So I like the idea of creating these sort of centralized, decentralized nodes, but complementing the larger system. We're not replacing them, we are complementing them. Just like these 15-minute city concepts, right? We are not saying we're not going to have highways or airports or high-speed rail, right? We are saying that these cities, in order to thrive and survive, need these de-infrastructured networks that create this localism and connections that are critical for resilience, and tie into those larger infrastructures, right? If that makes sense. So to me, it's complementary and not, it's not replacing.
Hey everybody, this is Neil. We are going to get back to this great conversation in just 1 second. But I think it's fair to say that right now we are facing some pretty unprecedented challenges in the 21st century. I mean, you name it, environmentally, socially, economically, we've got some big problems that we need to overcome. And that's why, for me personally, and the people that work with us at Latitude, we want to dedicate our time and our energy so that we are not only working to put food on the table and a roof over our heads, but also make the world a better place. And so if you are at all interested in combining your sustainability values with a very powerful financial model of real estate, then I highly encourage you to check out what we are doing at Latitude. We are creating something truly special with a tribe of change agents that for now is working across North America. And hopefully one day in the future, with you coming on board, we can be working across the globe. So please check us out. You can go to www.chooselatitude.com, or you can find us on social media at latitude.realty on Instagram, and we are also on Facebook. Okay, let's get back into it. What are some of the major tenets whenever you're working with clients, or just trying to explain this deeper of if you were to take a systems approach, what systems are you addressing? Is there a priority list to them, or you're going on all these areas at one time?
Yeah, I mean, well, there's also a lot of work that's been done around sort of third-party sustainability frameworks that attempt to frame a lot of these issues up, right? So we're building on elements that are in things like LEED-ND, frameworks like LEED-ND or eco districts, sustainable sites, international living, futures institutes, living communities challenge. Like there's great work, and a lot of these frameworks are organized around some of these major sort of flows that can help teams organize some of these things. But those third-party frameworks, I don't think replace good process and good design thinking, good system thinking, where you really have to be asking again the questions about how this project sits within the larger aspects of the region, of the community, of the city. I'm working right now in Austin, Texas, very progressive local government-led energy and water systems that appreciate the space that Austin is in within the larger context of Texas, right? And the vulnerabilities and political challenges of change in that state, but also absolutely value the critical nature of providing local solutions, local cogeneration in a building or district scale, on-site solar, right? They see these as really important investments from private and public sector to complement the larger infrastructure and make it more resilient. You would think that an energy provider would want to just make sure that they provided all of their energy because it costs, they're getting the cost from bills, right? But more energy providers and utility providers are obviously thinking about the inherent risk of losing service, of breakdowns, of fragile infrastructures, and are prioritizing more of these local investments. So to say that, all of these systems, again, need space to really understand how they're working, right? Where stuff comes from, where it goes, the sort of political landscape, the technical opportunities, and I think really importantly, the partners that you want to keep at the table to ensure that as you're de-infrastructuring, to keep sliding that word in, you're building the case with and for the people that these projects are going to work for, right? And that's really, really important. Building that kind of consensus around these solutions is critical.
I'm glad you brought up Austin as an example. I'm curious, in light of the recent 2020 ice storm that they had that just brought their energy grid to a grinding halt and all sorts of problems that arose from that. Do you see a route that they could take to really rethink the entire, like the state's macro view of how their system could work?
I do, and I would say that my technical expertise kind of stops at that kind of scale, to be honest, and advising utility providers and large scale sort of macro energy policy. However, I will say that the impacts of that event touched everybody and is now sort of front and center on investment, right? And again, like a lot of this conversation was not happening about reliability of gas, critical nature of our facilities. What does it mean to be resilient in Texas? How do we create local investment or larger partnerships? And what are the mechanisms to advance investment in this in the right way? So these breakdowns are not good, right? They're not good for anybody. But a silver lining is that there's now a sort of front and center conversation about systems approaches that allows for space in the conversation about what makes sense at what scale. So, and we're just going to have more and more and more of these, and not just breakdowns, but awareness of our systems as they're presented to us through different events. It's right. It's inevitable. So what teams are doing, not just me, of course, design teams at scales are asking the tough questions about how these systems need to be transformed to create the lives we want. And it's complicated. It's very complicated. But if we don't ask those questions, we're solving the wrong problems. Yeah.
Yeah. Wow. What this brings up for me is in some of the notes that I had made around deinfrastructuring and what that looks like on a community level of energy and microgrids, but also food and where like this local movement of food and how that's coming about, but also waste and water and how we're really living in a world in the 21st century that's baked into a 20th century model of commodities of in globalization and just fossil fuels. And what strikes me is that under the de-infrastructured kind of view of what that could be is the same thing that you were looking for whenever you're trying to find a home in a city, of what makes a community special and what are those bonds. And I think the social side is bolstered and really strengthened whenever you do think about this kind of approach to our society and to our infrastructure.
Yeah, I completely agree. It's really quite fascinating, and it's touched me certainly locally through the pandemic. The power of community, the power of neighborhood, the dependence that I've had here locally on my neighbors and close friends here has been critical to how we've navigated over the last 18 months, et cetera. So I think that the one of the most fundamental things we can do for our city is really start to ask questions about the systems that these neighborhoods live within, and spend more time with communities to help them understand not just current state, but also the historic decisions that have created some of the negative outcomes that we've had in our cities. And that is why I think this de-infrastructuring principle and creating intentionality around this sort of 15-minute city and de-infrastructuring is a really important kind of frame in which to address some of our historic inequities, socioeconomic divide, horrible redlining policies, and infrastructure investments that have just broken down some of the sort of fundamental connections that our cities need to be equitable, right? And it gets to the transparency idea, right? When more people understand the issues that they're living in and around, and the sort of nested scales that they're living in, the more that they can live with them and act positively to enforce them. But policies, design team investments, all of these things really need to have space to look backwards and really start to correct some of our investments that have created these inequities. And I'm a forward-looking person. Like I like to move fast and often to a flaw. Like let's start solving problems and let's do it. But we need to pause and say, how and why did we get here? And can we really start to break down some of those bad decisions, frankly, and bad investments that have created inequities in our cities?
What are some of the routes that you can go forward? I mean, specifically thinking about equity and access, it's such a hot topic right now. But I'm trying to think of what are some of those ways that you would advise a client, either a developer or a municipality, or even a neighborhood association, to use a concept like de-infrastructuring to address social inequity?
Yeah, it's a really important question. And one of the ways that I think is really important for design teams and policymakers or any urban actors is to educate ourselves on what those inequities are. I've been really proud of the work that Pittsburgh's done in and around building a set of equity indicators. Roughly, I'm going to get this wrong, 30 types of metrics around health and access and education that allow for more of a kind of a scan with the ability to go deep dive on what some of those inequities are. I think that's really, really important. Translating them sort of more locally into a neighborhood scale, that those indicators are more at a city scale. Data's out there. I mean, we've got really great GIS models from our city, from our transportation networks that have data that with which you can start to create more informed dialogue with our neighbors around, if that makes sense, right? The data doesn't, it doesn't replace good process, but if we don't have the sort of foundation of what we're solving for, again, on the wall, as we're starting to invest and create solutions, we're gonna miss something. And what may be even worse is we solve for one system and break another, right? And that's there's billions of examples of that, right? And so one of the direct answers I can have to your question is again finding space in the design process to have that information on the wall so you can really understand it and start to design for it. And you would be surprised how little of that happens as we're building buildings, shaping communities.
That doesn't surprise me at all, but yeah. I'm glad to hear you say that. I'm curious, you had a really amazing line in this article that for anybody who wants to know, we will link this in the show notes that you can find on our website at chooselatitude.com. But you said that you're talking about the political wins of this, and that in the United States, at least, so I'm sorry for our international listeners, but that President Biden was coming up with these policies that are novel yet obvious. And I'm curious to know really what your take is on the political winds of. Do you see winds of change coming on more adoption of this kind of urbanism philosophy?
I really hope so. I mean, I think a lot of my clients are anticipating funding flowing, but not planning around it, right? And the novel yet obvious is, the idea that infrastructure isn't a bridge alone, isn't a pipe, isn't a wire, right? It can't live without the sort of social constructs, the human networks that enable the kind of conversations that we're having right now, right? And it goes right to the heart of what we're talking about. We can't just provide high-speed rail solutions. We have to provide high-speed rail solutions in conjunction with really smart, localized, de-infrastructured investment that really hits local and with and for the neighborhoods that we're trying to really create equitable and sustainable investment in. Without that, yes, and we're not going to do it. We just can't. So the sort of build back better idea has to be with and for the people that we're solving for. And I'm hopeful that that's going to land in some very tangible ways. But just the tone of President Biden's documents and outreach and summaries of the plan is just I think a refresher for the urbanists and just army of folks who are trying to solve these problems in our cities, to give a little bit of weight to those messages that we're all going out and using as we approach these problems, right?
Yeah. And this is my hope with this podcast, is that ideas like this are going to land not just with the people that are making the policies and have the high-speed rail ideas of this is what we really need, but also is going to land at the community level to understand that we can start thinking about these and we can start making these links. Because the word that I love that you continuously bring back to is resilience. And that's what we're really going for, is how do we build a resilient future? And we had a developer on here on this podcast that was part of their mission statement is really talking about how do we design buildings that are designed for the 22nd century. And I love how it is, like what you're doing also is really stretching that continuum of time of looking back to look forward and really learning from that. So I think, I don't necessarily cold email people all the time based on one article to say, hey, we've got to join a conversation on the podcast. But I'm so glad that you're putting this work out there. Where do you start to see, and this is starting to kind of get to the conclusion of our time together. But I'm curious about where the people are in the world, Stephen, that are raising their hands and saying, we're really interested in your work. Is it US based? Are you across the continent or global? And what kind of projects those are?
Yeah, well, again, thank you so much for having me. And I've been very pleased with the outreach coming from the article, and grateful for folks who want to unpack it a little bit with me. So thank you for that. I think that, the principles that we're talking about here and the sort of processes are pretty, translatable anywhere. I've been very fortunate to have worked around the globe through my time with larger international engineering firms, and tackled some of the toughest projects and most progressive projects, in countries around the world. I also absolutely love working in my backyard and just spending time really going deep with relationships and really unpacking the layers of issues that surround a problem. I would just encourage folks who are maybe listening and suggest that there's a space for this in their projects to ask questions of the people you're working around. How do we ensure that we're not solving one system's problem at the impact of another, right? How are we ensuring that we're spending time to define resilience for our projects or investment? How are we spending time to define equity and really understand the problems we're trying to solve? And let it evolve from there. If your teams that you've surrounded yourselves with are struggling to find a process to place that into a digestible and translatable and understood language, then you probably have the wrong teams, right? And if as the projects or investments evolve, you got to find space. You just have to find space for those big, bold ideas, right? That sit across scale. And maybe at first you think there's absolutely no way, and we can't do it. Like there's too many players. There's not enough time or space, and we don't know where money's going to come from. Give those ideas space, right? Give them space, because we're going to need them. We're absolutely going to need them.
Oh, this is fantastic, Stephen. I cannot thank you enough for your time. It is very hopeful. It gives me a lot of hope, especially I know that you've got kids around our son's age as well. Just hope for a better future as well, to really address some of the large complex challenges that we're coming up against right now. And yeah, I really appreciate it. And I will just applaud the work that you're doing, and we'll share it. And that is why we're on now. So thank you for taking the time. And if anybody wants to check out more of Stephen's work, please go to his website. It is the Baumgartner Urban Systems Strategy. And again, such a brilliant article that ULI ended up sharing about deinfrastructuring, such a novel term. So thank you for the work that you're doing, Stephen, and thank you for the time.
Thank you very much, Neil. I really enjoyed it.
Okay, everybody, that is a wrap. This is another just great episode that I'm so glad that you're able to tune in. And thank you for being interested in regenerative real estate. What we are trying to do is help people and planet thrive together by using the built environment as a catalyst. And so I've got a couple big asks for you. Number one is, can you please go to wherever you're listening to this podcast, leave us a rating and review. Those actually go so far. And since this is such a passion project for us, we really want to be able to attract the best thought leaders from around the world. Second is that if you really like the content that we're putting out, you can find us on our own Medium publication called Regenerative Real Estate. We also have a very active community on Facebook, which is called Regenerative Real Estate and Design, which you can request to be a part of, and we would love to have you. And third, this goes to what we do every single day, helping buyers and sellers demystify sustainability by working with people that want to either buy a property and are trying to figure out the financing of how do I actually live out my values? How do I put that water catchment system on there? Or how do I go finance a solar panel PV array? Or maybe I want to live closer to nature. And what are the properties that are out there that I can do that? And so we represent buyers like that. We also happen to represent sellers that maybe they've already invested in sustainable features. Maybe they have a living building or a LEED certified project. We want to help tell that story. So much of what goes on in the real estate industry is transactional thinking at best, and it translates down into agents just really don't know anything about sustainability. And for us, we think that the value is there, and we want to help highlight really the intrinsic value of it, not just the bedrooms and the baths and the square feet of what typical marketing goes on. So if you know of anybody that wants to buy or sell these kinds of properties that we're talking about, please reach out to us at Latitude, and be sure to subscribe for another great episode coming up next week.